We're going to start the Sugya Mesirus Nefesh. And this Kovetz has 6 halakim, 6 parts that speak about 6 different aspects and 6 different anonim of Mesirus Nefesh, starting from the Shiur of Mesirus Nefesh, the Shorsh of Mesirus Nefesh, going all the way to the effect Mesirus Nefesh has on the Keches and how Mesirus Nefesh plays itself out in Aveda. Today we're going to do Chelik Aleph of the Kovetz, which is titled Mahut the Shorsh. We're going to speak about the definition of Mesirus Nefesh and the source of where Mesirus Nefesh comes from in Nefesh Ha'adam. So before we start, we'll just give a little akdama on what is Mesirus Nefesh, why is this a topic in Chassidus that speaks about Mesirus Nefesh. So Pashtos, the way the Welt learns Mesirus Nefesh, the way you learn Mesirus Nefesh al Pitera is that there's 3 Avedas that a person has to give his life up for the Eibishter, which is Aveda Zareh, Gil Arayis, and Shuchas Damim. That if a Goy Chas Hashalom asks a Yid to do one of these 3 things, he has to give his life up for the Eibishter. That's the mitzvah of an Ikdashti, like we're going to learn in the next Sikha. The mitzvah of an Ikdashti, that a person has to sanctify the Eibishter's name. Pari Kiddush Hashem means that a person has to give up his life for 3 Avedas in the Torah, which are Yehodik V'al Yaveh, as opposed to all the other 600 and the 600 mitzvahs. Besides these 3, it's only Yaveh and V'al Yehodik that the other of the Chiyuv over there is that a person should do the Aved as opposed to giving up his life. So Mesirus Nefesh is something which hardly ever happens in the Yid's Aveda. It's a fact. It's a special mitzvah that he has of the Nigdash to give up his life for the Eibishter. But if you look already in Gemara, we start explaining the Aveda of Krishma. It says V'chol nafshecha v'chol meidecha, that he has a chiyuv every single day to think about Mesirus Nefesh. It says regarding Shema Yisrael that Yid is Makabel El Malch Shamayim, Yid is Makabel El the Eibishter, and he has to remember the Inyan of Mesirus Nefesh. So we see Mesirus Nefesh isn't only something which is a fact, which is a mitzvah that a person gets to do in a once in a lifetime circumstance. Mesirus Nefesh has to do with an Aveda. There's a certain Aveda which reminds sich von a Yid, a certain Aveda which is demanded of Yid, the Aveda of Mesirus Nefesh. The Aveda of Mesirus Nefesh. Now, this Aveda of Mesirus Nefesh is explained in Chassidus Bariches. Where does Mesirus Nefesh come from? What does it mean Yid has to have Mesirus Nefesh? Starting from Tanya, I'll Rebbe focuses on Mesirus Nefesh in quite a few prakim. The main prakim is Perik Ches and Perik Chafei. Over there, the Rebbe explains that it says in the pasuk Befichu v'vavchal aseise. How can we say that his teremitas are relevant? How can we say that it's able to have Avin Yira to the Eibishter? Kikorev elach alav meid. The Rebbe explains that Yid has one of the explanations is Yid has Avin Musateres, and Yid has a Yerusha from Avraham Avinu, that a Yid has a kerach to give up his life from the Eibishter. And where does that come from? That comes from the Chachma Sheva Nefesh, a part of himself that is that he gets a Yerusha from Avraham Avinu that is able to give his life from the Eibishter. That's in Perik Ches. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on in Perik Chafei that this Inyan is negate to Yid's Aveda practically, not only when a Yid is able to give up his life for the Eibishter, but also when a Yid does Torah mitzvahs practically, the koach he has to go over there to overcome the Yitzhar is because he has this koach of Mesirus Nefesh. And that's a Moshe Rabbeinu. Like Alter Rebbe says in Perik Chafei, that Moshe Rabbeinu who commanded the Yidden before they went into Eretz Yisrael to read Shema twice a day. And one part of the elements of Shema is Lakaba Allah Malchus Shemaim, to accept the yoke of Shemaim with Mesirus Nefesh. Why is Moshe command them with Mesirus Nefesh? Why do they have to remember Mesirus Nefesh if it says clearly in the pasuk that the Yidden have nothing to worry about? So why is Moshe Rabbeinu, especially when they go into Eretz Yisrael, suddenly now they have to start remembering about Mesirus Nefesh, giving their life up for the Eibishter? So the Rebbe explains that he's telling them that their kiyum of Torah mitzvahs, their fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs is dependent on their koach of Mesirus Nefesh, is dependent on the concept of Mesirus Nefesh, that which a Yid could do Torah mitzvahs and overcomes Yitzhara, is because he has the ability to have Mesirus Nefesh, which is a kavua and his believer, which is instilled in his heart. Another time the Alter Rebbe actually also mentions Mesirus Nefesh is in Perik Vav Tanya, when the Alter Rebbe explains what Sitra Achra is, or something which is not a Likus is. The Alter Rebbe says anything which is not bottled the Eibishter is Sitra Achra, because it says Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu Sheila Ela Masha Batal Letzlei, that the Eibishter only has a connection to something which is nullified and submitted to him. So anything which is not submitted to him is Sitra Achra. Then the Alter Rebbe goes to explain, so what's the speciality of a Yid? A Malach is bottled the Eibishter all the time, but a Yid, how's Yid always connected to the Eibishter? So the Alter Rebbe says that Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu Sheila El Masha Batal Letzlei, that the Eibishter only connects to something which is submitted to him. whether it's bepeil, anything which has the ability, which has the potential to be brought to the Eibishter. And a Yid, how's a Yid that has the potential to be brought to the Eibishter? So the Rebbe says that a Yid is able to give his life up to the Eibishter any moment. Yeah, any moment a Yid is ready to give up his life to the Eibishter, even a Kalsha B'Kalim. And therefore, even if you have one Yid sitting in a room, and especially a son of Shchin, and that comes from because he has B'Koyach to give his life for the Eibishter. So Mrs. Nefesh isn't only something which is relevant in the time that a Goy Chas Shalom comes to a Yid and tells him to give his life up. Mrs. Nefesh is something which plays itself out in the day-to-day life of a Yid. Sign is a very B'Peil of Terem Mitzvahs, like we're going to see soon, and the Rebbe explains the Perek Chafei. And Sai, B'Negeh to the holiness of a Yid, that's some Kedusha of a Yid, the fact that a Yid is able to go Mrs. Nefesh B'Koyach means that Yid is special. Means that Yid is special. Yid is different than Nivroim. And like we're going to see soon, the speciality of a Yid, that which makes a Yid holy, that which makes a Yid Kaddish expresses itself in the Koyach Mesirus Nefesh. So that's what we're going to go through these different sichos that explain different inyanim Mesirus Nefesh, what Mesirus Nefesh is. Today we're going to focus on the first chelik of the Kovetz chelik Aleph, which is titled Mehusa, the Shorsh. These are two sichos that go through. One goes through the definition of Mesirus Nefesh, what is Mesirus Nefesh, and the second sicha goes through where does Mesirus Nefesh come from in a person. So the first sicha is the sicha from chelik Chaf, Parshas Vayera, the third sicha, which is a very fundamental sicha that explains the definition of Mesirus Nefesh in a very mechudish way that isn't explained in Chassidus so much. But the Rebbe Potash explains what does it mean Mesirus Nefesh. Before we get to where Mesirus Nefesh comes from in the Yid, and when does the Yid have the ability to go Mesirus Nefesh, the Rebbe explains what is Mesirus Nefesh. But when we say Chassidus Mesirus Nefesh, what is the true definition of Mesirus Nefesh? It's a sikha from Chelik Chav, Parshas Vayera, and the third sikha. The Rebbe starts off with explaining the uniqueness of the Mesirus Nefesh of Avraham Avinu. It says in Tanya that we get our Koyach Mesirus Nefesh from Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu was went to Mesirus Nefesh multiple times. And the example of Mesirus Nefesh, when we mention Mesirus Nefesh in Yid's Aveda, is from the Nisan of the Akedah, which Avraham Avinu went to Mesirus Nefesh by bringing up his son, when the Eibishter asked him to bring up his son Yitzchak for Akedah Yitzchak. Now, we find something interesting by the Lashon that the Eibishter used to ask Avraham Avinu to bring up his son. The Eibishter says, Kach no es bincha. Usually when the Eibishter told Avraham Avinu to do something, or tells anyone to do something, the Eibishter commands. And the definition of a command means, I'm telling you to do something. Here the Eibishter used the Lashon, Kach no. Kach no means, please take your son. And the Gemara asks, why did it say no? Why did the Eibishter say, please take your son? So the Gemara answers that the Eibishter was telling Avram had to plead with Avram to take his son. Not because, we're going to see soon, not because Avram's not going to listen to him, but for Avram Avinu's sake. Why for Avram Avinu's sake? Because the Eibishter is saying that if Avram Avinu doesn't take his son, doesn't pass this test, then people are going to say, people are going to say that all the first tests, this was the 10th test. People are going to say all the 9 tests that you went through, they were nothing. They were nothing. If you don't pass this one, it's as if all the ones in Torah were fake. And the obvious question is, what does it mean all the ones in Torah were fake? Just because they didn't pass the biggest test of all means that all the past tests are fake. So you could say that this was the first test that went against Avraham Avinu's nature, like it brings down a few times that Avraham Avinu served the Eibishter mi'avah, Avraham Avinu was mitzvah chesed, and this was the first aveda that Avraham Avinu was demanding to Avraham to be mitzvah yira, or going against the nature of going against the nature of chesed. To take his son against his nature, that was the first time he went against his nature. So you could say that if Avraham doesn't pass this test, it means that all the other tests were natural. That's not a good shot, because just because Avram's nature was chesed, it doesn't mean that all the other avodas weren't hard. It was still that all the other insanes weren't hard. It was still in his side. It doesn't mean that it didn't go against. It didn't go completely against his nature, but it was still in his side. So mainly we have to understand, what does it mean that ein mamash b'Hashem? What does ein mamash means? There's nothing. There's empty, which means that all the others were fake. How can all the other ones be fake? That's question number one. Another thing that Abba asks is, which is a question from the Ikrim, that we know that the Akedah, we mentioned the Akedah every single day in davening. And one of the reasons that is, in order to remind the Eibishter of the Mesirus Nefesh of Avraham Avinu. Well, the question is, there's a lot of Yidden who gave their lives up from the Eibishter, for the Eibishter throughout the generations. In every single generations, and if you look at that sort of Hanug Malchus, they gave their life in the most gruesome way. So why do you mention Afka the Akedah? And especially that the Eibishter asked, in a way, Avraham Avinu's Nisayon was lighter Because Avraham Avinu was the Eibishter asked him personally to do it, as opposed to all the other tzaddikim, they weren't asked personally; they did it because of the mitzvah. You can't say that it has to do with children, that Avraham Avinu gave up his child, because then throughout the generations, a lot of people gave up their children. Like the famous story of Hannah and his 7 sons. That brings in the other that there's other stories that it wasn't that it was different. It wasn't Hannah. It was Miriam Bastamchum. Where we see that quite a few people gave up even the children for the Eibishter. And so much so, if you look in Tur, when he goes to the halachas of Mesirus Nefesh, so the Beis Yosef brings down different shuvas of different tkufis where people kill their children in order they shouldn't go through shmat, which is there's the whole question if it's mutter or not according to halacha. But the nekud is that people gave up their children for the Eibishter, even more than Avraham Avinu. Mela, what's so special? Why? Obviously, the Akedah is special, but why is it so significant that after the Akedah you mentioned over all the other and Nisyanis Yidden went throughout the generation? So the explanation of the second question is that's both an Chassidus that Avraham Avinu was the first one who did Mesirus Nefesh. All the other generations they did Mesirus Nefesh after it was already came after Avraham Avinu. But Avraham Avinu was the first one. He was Pasach Hatzini. He was the first one who started the concept of Mesirus Nefesh. And we know Kol Aschal is koshes, that any time you start a concept, it's harder. So therefore, Avraham Avinu's Mesirus Nefesh was harder than all the other Mesirus Nefesh in the future generations. Even though in quantity, it could be that in other generations, the Mesirus Nefesh is much greater. But in quality, which means in the hardship of the Mesirus Nefesh, since Avraham Avinu was the first one, therefore we mentioned the Akedah, by davening every single day. So the question of that is that even of Avraham Avinu itself, we know that Avraham Avinu went through the Nisayon of Urkastin. Avraham Avinu was thrown into the fire, and he miraculously survived the fire by Nimrod. So even Avraham Avinu, his first Mesirus Nefesh wasn't the Akedah. His first Mesirus Nefesh was much way before when he was in Urkastin. But Mela, we have to say there's a big difference between the Mesirus Nefesh of Urkastin and the Mesirus Nefesh of the Akedah. And Dafka, the Akedah was special because the Akedah was Pasach as a sinner. The Akedah had something that all the other Mesirus Nefesh that Avraham Avinu didn't have in that before. And what's the difference between Mesirus Nefesh? If someone's giving up their life, so he's giving up their life. How can there be levels? What does it mean there's levels of a person giving up their life for the Eibishter? And this is where the beer starts. The Rebbe starts explaining what is Mesirus Nefesh. That you could have someone giving up their life, but it's not the true definition of Mesirus Nefesh. The Akedah was the true definition of Mesirus Nefesh. What does it mean? Why was Dafka the Akedah Pasach Hatzini? Why was the Akedah, do we say about the Akedah opened up, the source opened up the pipe from Mesirus Nefesh? There were other times of Mesirus Nefesh. Why do you have to come to the Akedah? The Akedah opened up the source of Mesirus Nefesh. So the answer is, what does it mean Avraham Avinu opened up the pipe? What is a pipe? A pipe is something that brings something from place A to place B. In other words, you have revolutionaries. You have people who do things the first. And you have the concept of Kol Aschal Iskashis. When you do something the first, so then if you do something the first, so then it's hard. And in general, in Yiddishkeit also, you have people who are the first ones to do things. And Avraham Avinu was the first one to start proclaiming the Eibishter's name. But not about everything we say, Pasach Hatzina. We don't use the terminology of he opened the pipe, which means that he opened up the source. What does it mean that he opened up the source? So a pipe is something that brings something from place A to place B. What does it mean that Avraham Avinu opened up the pipe of Mesirus Nefesh? When we says that Avraham Avinu opened up the pipe of Mesirus Nefesh means that Avraham Avinu brought down the concept of Mesirus Nefesh to the world, not as a new concept, but a concept which is against the world's nature. Why is Mesirus Nefesh against the world's nature? What is the definition of the world? What is the definition of Eilam? The definition of the world is creation. A creation. What does a creation mean? A creation means the Eibishter created a separate entity. Kaviyachal doesn't have any connection to Likkutei, and that entity is defined by his limitations. Sai is man, Sai is makim, and then each nivra has its own definition. Sai if it's a behema, dem it's meichai medaber, and in chai dem it's meichai medaber itself. Each medaber, for example, has its own definitions. In the same Shabbos, in parts of Fame Shabbos. Each nivra has its own definition of who he is and how he thinks. Part of the definitions of a nivra is that he defines limited to being a nivra. He's limited to being a existence, because the nivra by definition means he exists. A yesh means the Eibishter created yesh me'ayin. There was nothing, and then the Eibishter made a nivra, which is a definition. By definition means he exists. A yesh, he exists. And that's the whole definition of a nivra. The definition of a nivra means that he says that I exist. If not, he's not a nivra. A nivra means that he's a yesh that exists. What is Mesirus Nefesh? So usually we touch Mesirus Nefesh means that a person gives up his life for the Eibishter. But really, that's only the external, that's only chitzenistic pshat Mesirus Nefesh. That's all the outcome of what Mesirus Nefesh really is. When he gives his life for the Eibishter, it's an outcome of what the true concept of Mesirus Nefesh is. What is the true concept of Mesirus Nefesh? The true concept of Mesirus Nefesh is that a Yid gives up his Nefesh. A Yid gives up his definition of saying that he exists, a Yid gives that up. Which means that a Yid has the element, a Yid has the ability inside himself that even though by definition, a Nivra means that he says he's a Yesh, and even though by definition a Nivra says that I exist, and that is definition the way the Eibishter created him, a Yid has the ability to go out of that limitation, to go out of that definition, and be battles the complete of the Eibishter Neifen, that he completely doesn't exist. Not in a Neifen that he serves the Eibishter with his being, in a Neifen that he stops to exist. In the terms of Chassidus, his bad bitul mitzias. You have bitul yesh. Bitul yesh means that a nivra submits himself as in his realms of definitions of existing. He serves the Eibishter as existing mitzias. Then you have bitul mitzias. Bitul mitzias means that he doesn't exist anymore. His whole definition is that he doesn't exist anymore. That is the definition of Mesirus Nefesh. That is the definition of bitul mitzias. So what comes out of it is that Mesirus Nefesh is something which is against the definition of the world. Mesirus Nefesh is against the definition of a nivra. A nivra means you exist, and Mesirus Nefesh means that he doesn't exist. So how does a nivra come to the concept of Mesirus Nefesh? Mainly have other concepts in the world that are introduced to nivraim, other concepts in the world, even levels of alakus that are shaykh to nivraim, even levels of alakus that weren't in the world before, but now are nimshach in the world. That's all something which is in the definition of the world. But here you're saying there's a concept that the Yid has that is completely eis nivra, that is completely eis definition of being eis definition of being of existing. Where does that come from? That's why you have to have Pasach Hatzinik. That was the Keich of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu was Zeiche. That through Avraham Avinu was Nimshach, a new concept of the world that never existed before, and that couldn't exist in the concept of the world. That is against the definition of the world. That comes from Avraham Avinu. And that's the Yerusha that we have from Avraham Avinu, that we're able to get to this concept, we're able to get to a concept of being Eish Nivra, of stop being defined by existing, and start to be defined by not existing. Stop being defined by being bottom mitzvahs. Now, through this, we're going to explain why the true definition of Mesirus Nefesh is shaykh only by Yid and not by a Goy. Goyim can also go Mesirus Nefesh. But when a Goy goes Mesirus Nefesh, he's doing a practical Mesirus Nefesh. He's doing the outcome of what Mesirus Nefesh of a Yid is. He's going in practically he's going Mesirus Nefesh. But the inyan of Mesirus Nefesh, the concept, the true concept of giving over and being bottom mitzvahs, he doesn't have. He's not able to reach. He doesn't have a neshama. Since he's not a neshama, he's not able to reach such madrega. When a guy goes to Mesirus Nefesh, the reason why he goes to Mesirus Nefesh practically is adarabah. The reason why he goes to Mesirus Nefesh is because it's something that completes his mitzvahs, completes his existence. Either it's on a grabba level that he believes he's going to be rewarded for him going to Mesirus Nefesh, or that's for sure coming to complete his existence. But even if he's going to Mesirus Nefesh for kilul lishma, that he believes in an idea so strongly, or in a value, he has a value which is so strong that he's ready to give his life up for it, that also is connected with his mitzvahs. That also isn't detached from his mitzvahs. Adarabah completes his mitzvahs. That is sai in two ways. Either it's that he feels so much for the idea, so much for the value that he can't detach himself from it. And therefore he believes in an idea so much that he feels that his whole existence depends on the completion of that idea. Or it's in the shnuzdik way, that he feels that he doesn't have any life without that idea. He doesn't have any life without that value. But in both of these ways, it has to do with his seichel, that his machriachim, his seichel, his mitzias tells him to do something which completes his mitzias. His mitzias tells him that you're not worth anything if you don't have this idea. Or his mitzias tells him that your life, this idea is worth more than you. But at the end of the day, it's coming from his mitzias. That the source of that is coming from his definition of a yesh, which means a yesh means that he says that he exists. Sheikim says nefesh v'yid. Says nefesh Avraham Avinu was that it was coming from the inyan Mesirus Nefesh, not the practical idea of giving your life up. The fact that Avraham Avinu gave his life up was the outcome of what Avraham Avinu really had possessed inside of him. The inyan Mesirus Nefesh, which the inyan Mesirus Nefesh is complete bottom mitzias, complete saying that he doesn't exist. Your existence means that you don't exist. Now that expresses itself by the nisayon of the Akedah more than any other nisayon that Avraham Avinu had. But the other nisayons have always cast in. When Avraham Avinu gave his life up to spread the Likkutei in the world, even though he was doing it for the Eibishter, the previous he was doing it for the Eibishter, and the previous he was doing it because he had a part inside himself that was bottom mitzvahs. But b'chitzenish, a person could say that Avraham Avinu was giving his life up because he believes in the idea so strongly that he's ready to be Mesirus Nefesh. So it's not an existence of kedusha. It's a cheshbon of kedusha. It's an existence of kedusha, which means that it exists, but in a holy way. On the other hand, it still means it exists. It still means that it's coming from a cheshbon. It's coming from an idea that he's connecting himself to. Mashen Kain, the avodah of the Nisayon of the Akedah, the Nisayon of the Akedah had no motives whatsoever that Avraham Avinu should be Mesirus Nefesh. Sai, practically, there was no one was going to see the Akedah. No one was there to even know that he even did it. But even more so, it was against any idea or any connection that Avraham Avinu had to the idea of a person with the Kozen. The Ebsha said, which means that the emes of Likus is going to express itself in Yitzchak being a descendant of Avraham, and here comes Avraham and bring Yitzchak in the Mizbeach, which is going to go against the whole foundation that Avraham Avinu founded his whole life, that the Ebsha is the true Ebsha. So the Nisayon of the Akedah wasn't only something which Avraham Avinu had to break himself to go and to go and do on a natural level, that it was against his nature, but even more so it was against his connection to the Eibishter in that way that he was mefayis from the Eibishter's godless in the world. And Avraham Avinu still did it. Why? Why did Avraham Avinu still do it? Because that is the true definition of Mesirus Nefesh. The true Inyan of Mesirus Nefesh means that he's bottom mitzvah to the Eibishter. It doesn't matter if he understands, it doesn't matter if he doesn't understand. His Inyan needs to connect to the Eibishter in a way that he doesn't exist. His mitzvah doesn't exist. And that's why he's able to connect to the Eibishter in such a way that even if it goes against anything he thinks he exists for, he's still going to do it because there's a part of him which is bad and bottom mitzvahs. There's a part of him that doesn't exist, and that's what it means that if Avraham Avinu didn't do the Akedah, they'll say that all the Nisayonos before that were all nothing. What do you mean they were nothing? They weren't the true pshat of Mesirus Nefesh. They weren't the true pshat the bottom mitzvahs. They could have been coming from his mitzvahs, coming from his existence. It wasn't the true definition of going out of your existence. Now that Avraham Avinu did Nisayon Akedah, was Megala that all the Nisayonos he had in Torah were coming from the same Likkutei, from the same Inyan of the true Pshat Mesirus Nefesh, that he's giving up his existence for the Eibishter. And that's the Yerusha, that's the Pasach HaTziner. That would mean that Avraham Avinu opened the new pipe, or Avraham Avinu opened a new foundation, and gave that an inheritance to Yidden. That a Yid, no matter where he is, no matter what darga Yid goes to Mesirus Nefesh, his emes a Yid that's a part of himself, which be'etzem is bottom mitzvahs. A Yid is a part of himself which is not existent. And anytime a Yid goes to Mesirus Nefesh, no matter what a Yid does, even though b'chitzenis it could look like it's coming from his motives, it's coming from his ideas, it's coming from his mitzvahs, even a mitzvahs the kedusha. But b'primius it's coming from a Yerusha that he gets from Avraham Avinu, that a Yid is be'etzem is able to be bottom mitzvahs the lakos. And even b'chitzenis, it looks like he's coming from his mitzvahs, but b'primius, his emes is that he's bottom mitzvahs. So that's the first sikha. What comes from the first sikha is that there's two inyanim Mesirus Nefesh. If you could say there's the ma'aseh of Mesirus Nefesh, and then there's the inyan of Mesirus Nefesh. The ma'aseh, the action of Mesirus Nefesh is that a person gives his life up for the Eibishter. That's the action of Mesirus Nefesh. And that a lot of people can have. A person going to have the course have that a person could give his life up for an idea. The Mesirus Nefesh of a Yid isn't an action. The Mesirus Nefesh of a Yid is the inyan. The Mesirus Nefesh of a Yid is a concept that a Yid has, which is be'etzem higher than his existence. A Yid has a concept inside of himself. Yid has the inyan inside of himself, which he's able to be bottom mitzvahs, which means he's able to not to be existent, and together with that, he have an element which is non-existent, higher than the definition of nivraim, which a nivra says a definition of a nivra is that he exists. Comes in Mesirus Nefesh and says that he don't exist. Comes Mesirus Nefesh means that you have an element that says I don't exist. And that's when we come on to the second sikh of the Kovetz, which explains the shorsh of Mesirus Nefesh. Instead of we explain in more analysis of Aveda, what is Mesirus Nefesh, or that we define what Mesirus Nefesh is. The next sikh explains the shorsh where a Yid gets Mesirus Nefesh from in Nefesh Adam. So it's a sikh in Chelik Amalav, Pashish Kolm. It's a very short sikh. And the Rebbe starts explaining the meaning of Machzah Shekel. Machzah Shekel has two opposites to it. Mitzad Echad says regarding Machzah Shekel, there's a mitzvah to give half a shekel every single year. They used to give half a shekel to Beis Hamikdash. And it has two opposites. On one hand, Machzah Shekel is half a shekel. The Torah doesn't say to give 10 geta. A shekel is 20 geta. The Torah doesn't say to give 10 geta. The Torah says to give half a shekel, which means it has to be specifically half. And that's the geta there. So the currency you give has to be specifically a half a coin. Which half is usually in Kedusha. We don't have half. And usually everything in Kedusha has to be full. Tmimim and shleimim and full. Kabbalas have to be, a carbon has to be completely full. Here we say you have to give half a shekel, which means you have to give, there's a concept of a half in Kedusha. On the other hand, we see that Machzah Shekel, as opposed to other payments you have to give in Kedusha, other payments you could pay in installments. When it comes to Machzah Shekel, the whole thing has to be given in one time. You can't give You can't give it in installments. It has to be done at one time. So these two concepts are opposite from each other. One hand you say you have to give half a shekel. Half a shekel means that it's only a half. It's not a complete item. On the other hand, you're saying from the person's perspective, the person who's giving the half a shekel, he has to have, it's on the gavra, he has to have a complete nesina, he has to have a complete giving to the Beis HaMikdash and not an installment. So how do these two things, what are the connection of these two things together, of the half a shekel and the action the person does has to be complete? That's explained, the Rebbe starts explaining the Indian of machzah shekel of Chassidus. It says in Chassidus that the half a shekel, what is that? Why does he have to give half a shekel? Because a half a shekel is an remez, is a hint that Eid is only half. Eid isn't complete. Why is Eid only half? Why is Eid only half? Because explain the Chassidus that the Eid Betzim is half, because the other half is the Eibishter. It says that the Eibishter and Knesset Yisrael are nimshal to two halves, are like two halves. The Maggid says in the Pasuk, the famous title of the Maggid says that chatzoi tzuris, which means that a yid is a half a form of the Eibishter. What does it mean? Yid is a half of the Eibishter. So the Maggid, if you look at the Maggid and the way Chassidus usually explains it, the Maggid usually explains in an Aveda, which means that a person can have an effect on the Maila. One of the biggest statements of Chassidus is that a person's Aveda has an effect on the Mesirus Nefesh. A person Aveda, like it says Avayit Tzilcha, says that the Eibishter is the shadow or the shade of a Yid, which means that when a Yid does something Lamata, has an effect on Halakus L'mayla. Even though the Pashas mitzvahs are there for the person, but there's all you say the Chassidus is that a person can have an effect on the Svidus and the Yonam L'mayla. Like it says also, Da L'mayla Nimach, that whatever comes, L'mayla comes from you. So that's he said in Aveda, that a person's Aveda has an effect on the L'mayla. And a lot of times the Chassidus bring the Torah of the Maggid, that the Maggid is trying to explain how a Yid is able to have an effect on the L'mayla. Why? Because Yid is a half the Eibishter's second half. What does it mean the Eibishter's second half? Which means that a Yid, whatever he does L'mayla, the other half comes, whatever he does L'mata, the other half comes L'mayla. Here the Rebbe gives a different beer, which we don't usually explain this to explain the Maggid. The Rebbe explain what does it mean Yid is a half? Yid is a half because the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya Perek Beis that a Yid, the neshama of Yid is a chelik l'kam imam mamish, which means the neshama down here is a chelik of the Eibishter. It's interesting that the Rebbe brings also from another sefer called Shef Atal. And the sefer Shef Atal is a Kabbalah sefer, and if you look at Alter Rebbe's Igris, it's a fascinating Igris. Alter Rebbe writes all the questions he was asked in the interrogation when he was arrested. And one of the questions he was asked was to explain what Chassidus is, what Chassidus Chabad is. What the cult of Chassidus is. So the Rebbe starts explaining that he went to the Maggid when he was around 20 years old, and he started learning Kabbalah. And now he explains now. The Rebbe writes he founded Chassidus based on Kabbalah, and he writes there's a few foundational svarim on Kabbalah, and this is one of the svarim. He says the Sefer of Shef Atal, he writes Shara Eira, and the Sefer Shef Atal is a foundational sefer on Kabbalah, and he's basing Chassidus Chabad on those svarim. And if you look in that sefer in the Agdama, where the Rebbe's been signed over here. He puts down the aside of Perek Beis Tanya of Nefesh Hashenis B'Yisrael Chelik L'Kam Imam Mamish. He was the first one, I think, who puts down the aside that the Nefesh of a Yid, the Neshama of Yid, is the Chelik L'Kam Imam Mamish. And he got a lot of flack for it. He got a lot of opposition because a lot of other Mekwalim were saying, "What should he saying a Chelik of the Eibishter?" And he had to write a whole kuntis. And there was a Matzayin over was Sefer Nishmas Shiftei Levi, which he wrote a whole kuntis to explain what he meant by Chelik L'Kam Imam Mamish, how you could say a Chelik for the Eibishter. And that's all that Chagav. But the foundation, this foundation, Torah says in Tanya, is already in this Sefer Kabbalah. So what does it mean? He is a Chelik L'Kam Imam Mamish. So what it means practically is that every single concept in the world of Nivraim, even the highest Nivraim like Malachim, all creations. And the creation, which by definition of creation means, like you said before, the creation means that he exists. He exists means he's a yeshut of a niflat. He's a yeshut something which is separated from Malakut, separated from the Eibishter. And even the highest Malachim, all only bitla yesh. Why? Because they come from Ilma Abriya, which Ilma Abriya means is already a creation of it. Comes the Eibishter and makes a Yid. What is a Yid? He is a neshama. What is the neshama? The neshama is a lakus. The neshama is the Eibishter. Every single Yid has a part of himself which b'atzim is a lakus. So a Mela, there's a big difference between a Yid serving the Eibishter and a Nivra serving the Eibishter. When a Nivra serves the Eibishter, when a Geila Havdil serves the Eibishter, he's serving the Eibishter as a Nivra, he's serving the Eibishter as an entity. as a existence connected to something separated from his existence. As opposed to when he does a mitzvah, when he connects to the Eibishter, when he connects to the Eibishter, he's not doing something which is separate than his mitzvahs. He's doing something which is his etzem mitzvahs. Why? Because he is a chelik in the kaim. He is a second half of the Eibishter. He's a part of the Eibishter. The way the Eibishter put himself down into neshama muguf, and that's in your machzah shekel. Machzah shekel means that a person, the Aveda Machzah Shekel means that a person is made inside himself. The part of himself which is a Machzah, which is the second half of the Eibishter. Now, where does he see in Yid's Aveda? This time we get to Mesirus Nefesh. Where do we see in Yid's Aveda this concept of the neshama? In other words, where do you see in Yid's Aveda when he does mitzvahs? So he's doing something but Maisa with Machshav the Maisa. He's doing something which is levushim, which Kaviyachal Gek also do mitzvahs. Gek also do action which is connected to the Eibishter. And when he learns Torah, so Gek also learns Torah, the action of learning Torah. Where does it express that he is a chelik and the kaim mimal mamish? Where does it express that he is a lakus? The only Aveda that he has that expresses he's a lakus is the Aveda Mesirus Nefesh. Why? What is the Aveda Mesirus Nefesh? Especially like we explained them before. The muhus, the inyan of Mesirus Nefesh. What is the muhus of Mesirus Nefesh? Is the muhus of Mesirus Nefesh means that I don't exist. The muhus of Mesirus Nefesh means that I don't exist on even the highest level, even the highest ideas, the highest connections that I have to an idea. That itself, I'm higher than that. Where does that come from? Where does it come from that a nivra could say that he's higher than being a nivra? Where does it come from that a nivra could say that he's higher than existing? So last week we explained the concept of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu brought a new concept to the world, something which is against the definition of the world. But here we're saying in the basis of the Yid Neshama, that which a Yid is able to go Mesirus Nefesh, the true pshat Mesirus Nefesh. That which Yid is able to go Mesirus Nefesh means, the highest level Mesirus Nefesh means, or the inyan Mesirus Nefesh, the definition of Mesirus Nefesh, that he doesn't exist, that he's giving away himself, he's giving away his nefesh, the ich, he's giving that away, he's putting that aside. That which you could do that, which even though it's against the definition of a nivra, means that he has a part of himself which is completely higher than nivra. He has a part of himself that, legabe that part of himself, he can't be separated from the Eibishter. Legabe that part of himself, he can't exist as a nivra. Or in Lashon Avayom Yamiz, as nita vil, nita can't, as I know from the Eibishter, that is a lag of a Yid, that level of Yid cannot be separate from the Eibishter. He feels that without being connected to the Eibishter, even for a split second, Aveda Zara doesn't take so long. A Yid could do an Aveda, or could have an Aveda Zara for a split second. For that split second, he feels he cannot be separated from the Eibishter. Why can he not be separated from the Eibishter? L'chayda, he's a Nivra. L'chayda, by definition, he is separated from the Eibishter. By definition, he does exist as a separate entity. The reason for that is because he is the second half of the Eibishter, which means he is a chelik mimal mamish, and like that darga of chelik mimal mamish, even for a split second, nita vil, nita can't, he cannot be separate from the Eibishter, even for a split second. Efshar klal lichur b'Hashem echad. This lashon Alter Rebbe in Tanya. Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya that mitzad the darga of chacham shev nefesh, efshar he's not able to be separated from the Eibishter. So the muhus of Yid Neshama, that which he is a Yid is a chelik lekam mimal mamish, that expresses itself in Aveda Mesirus Nefesh. That's the only Aveda that a Yid could do. That mitzad that Aveda could pinpoint and say, oh, that's a chelik lekam mimal mamish. A lot of other Avedas that Yid does, he's doing it as a separate entity. He's doing it as a nivra. Anina beis nesham sheskeni. Even when a Yid learns Torah, he's learning Torah that his mitzvah should have lakus. And even when a Yid does a mitzvah, he's doing it. He's doing it as a nivra. And it comes from, he's connected to the neshama, but the vart is the neshama, the way the neshama is a nivra. Here comes an Aveda Mesirus Nefesh. Of the Aveda Mesirus Nefesh, like I said before, means you say you're not a nivra. You don't exist. Bittul mitzvah is not b'tayesh. And that's where the Aveda of the chelik lekam mamish, that's where it expresses itself in the Aveda Mesirus Nefesh. And that's why Machzah Shekel has two parts to it. Has sai chatzi, sai half. On the other hand, there has to be nesina tama, has to be a complete nesina, something which is complete, not in installments. Because when a Yid feels himself as a half, when a Yid feels himself has this nakuda machatzis, which the nakuda machatzis means that he's a chelik lekam mamish, which is the Aveda Mesirus Nefesh. In Mesirus Nefesh has no levels. You can't say a person is half giving over Mesirus Nefesh, or a person is giving over completely himself. This nakud that the Yid is connected to the Eibishter and he can't be separated is a complete nakud. There's no levels in Mesirus Nefesh. It's one inyan that he can't be separated from the Eibishter. And if he can't be separated from the Eibishter, he's giving his whole life up from the Eibishter. He's not giving over half a life. He's not giving over a little bit of himself. His whole life he gives to the Eibishter because he feels that is his mitzvah, that is his entity. And that's the inyan of Mesirus Nefesh and a Yid. That Mesirus Nefesh and a Yid Aveda, the shayrish of Mesirus Nefesh is that he is the chelik elikayim mamash. If you go more with practice, what does it mean? In the chelik elikayim mamash, there's a lot of different madrigas. But if you stick both sichos together, save the emes inyan Mesirus Nefesh. The emes inyan Mesirus Nefesh is bittul mitzias. Together, what we're saying over here, that he is the chatzitzura, that in the Yid Aveda also you can have beruchnias. You can also have different dargas, different madrigas in Yid Neshama, that they are also mechayim Mesirus Nefesh. Like it says in Chassidus, the guy, there's different levels of Mesirus Nefesh of Mesirus Nefesh of Chai, Mesirus Nefesh of even of Nefesh. There's different levels of a Yid giving his life up from the Eibishter. But the emes level of Mesirus Nefesh comes from Yechida. Yechida liyachtav. Why? Because like I said before, the true inyan of Mesirus Nefesh, the true concept of Mesirus Nefesh, that when a Yid gives his life up from the Eibishter, not because he understands he has to do it, not because he feels he has to do it. It's not a chukka that a Yid, there are levels that a Yid is, like Rabbi Akiva says, that that his whole life he was waiting to come to his Nefesh. Here we're talking about level of Mesirus Nefesh of nitavil nitaken, which means it's shlila, which means his whole life he doesn't feel anything besides the Eibishter. He doesn't have any other entity besides the Eibishter. That comes from Yechida. This nakuda that a person feels, not that there is a nakuda chassidus that you feel ki hu chayecha, which something is brought down that a person can call Mesirus Nefesh because he feels that's his life. Here we're saying a different nakuda. The nakuda Mesirus Nefesh over here is that nita vil nita ken, that he doesn't, he feels that without this he doesn't have anything. This is his true metzias. This is true metzias. Not only understands the Eibishter is mechayim and like every single neighbor, etc., but the Yid feels that the part of himself that doesn't exist, a part of himself that's built on metzias. And the guy with that part that's built on metzias, his whole metzias is a likus, and he's not able to. Nita can. He's not able to. That's because Yid is a chatzitzur. Yid is a chelik elikayim mamash. And mitzad that part of the Yid neshama, a Yid nita can are not based from the Eibishter. You know, that Rebbe in the Kovetz Rosh Hashanah, that there's two madrigas in the Yid. There's Yaakov and Yisrael. The Rebbe says Yaakov is the madrig of a Yid that's established in the Guf, that comes down as a separate entity, the way the part of the Neshama is already in existence. Yisrael is a part of the Neshama, Li Reish, which is a part of a Yid that stays the chelik elikam, which stays the Likus and Gansen. And that part can never be separate in the Eibishter. That part can never be separate from the Likus. And even when it says the Kodesh is only negated to the Madrig of Yaakov, not the Madrig of Yisrael. What the Rebbe says over there, interesting Nikudah, that a father and a son are also the same inyan. A father, the son is also a chelik of the father. The son is also the same entity of his father. That's why a father loves his son, etc. But we see B'Peil, number one, not always a son gives his life up for his father. And Api Halacha, it's Chayacha Kedin. Api Halacha, a son is not mechuyev to give his life up for his father if there's ever a scenario. And even when you get to his Aveda, if you have your Aveda, your lost object, or your father's, is your Aveda's first. So we see that even according to Halacha, together the person being the same entity as his father, B'Peil, he's a chelik, which that's the part of him that's connected to his father, isn't their head, doesn't become his whole mitzvah. And therefore he doesn't have to give up his life for his father. Because the emes in Mesirus Nefesh cannot be to give yourself up for something which is not you. But a Yid, inside the Madrig of Yisrael, is a chelik elikayim mamash. Sai, even when he's in the Shram Aguf, he's still the chelik elikayim mamash, which means the Yid is a part of himself that isn't him, a part of himself which is the Eibishter. And that's just a chiyuv from Mesirus Nefesh, like we're going to see soon in the next chelik. How can there be a chiyuv for the emes in Mesirus Nefesh of being bottom mitzvahs? Because the Yid is a part of himself which is bottom mitzvahs, and that's the emes. And the guy by that, the can sign numbers from the Eibishter. The guy by that, he can never be separate from the Eibishter. Because the guy by that, his identity of that, of the part of it of himself that's his identity of Yisrael, of chelik elikayim mamash. That's that. And just like he has a part of himself that wants to exist, he has a part of himself that doesn't want to exist. And that's the emsinyah of the shadish Mesirus Nefesh of a Yid, and the koach that the Mesirus Nefesh of a Yid has is be'etzem, where Elikus is in this bate, the neshama of a Yid is in this bate in Elam Hazah. So that's the end of Chelik Aleph. And next year we're going to focus on Mr. Hashem, Chelik Beis of the Kovetz, which is Chiyuva, which is going in the Chiyuva Mesirus Nefesh, explaining the Chiyuva Mesirus Nefesh Api Nigle, three different sichos that explain the concept of Mesirus Nefesh Api Nigle, and the Chiyuva of a Nigdash that every Yid has to give his life out from the Eibishter.